So thank you so much for joining us tonight and for taking the time out to basically speak about a very topical subject. But before we do, I might introduce you so that everyone can get to know you a little bit better. So tell everyone about yourself. What do you do Monday to Friday? Because that's very relevant to why you're here tonight.
Sure. So Monday to Friday, I work as a professional counsellor in private practice, mainly in Parramatta. I see mostly individuals for all sorts of issues. And I also work part-time in a superannuation company. So two very different jobs, but I like what I do.
Oh, lovely. So second question, how has coronavirus affected the way you work?
So after the stage 1 restrictions came into place, I started to see my clients online. I'd never done it before. So it was a bit of an adjustment. And because I think I feel like I lose a little bit of the connection over the screen. So 2/3 of my work at the moment is still done online. But I've started to transition 1 day a week back face to face, and I think clients really appreciate that. And also the issues that come up as well. People, they're initially talking a lot about COVID. So different issues coming up because of COVID. Mm.
Did you find that you got busier or quieter? Like, were people kind of reaching out more during this period of time, or did you just see people shut off completely because of all the restrictions and the social distancing?
Yeah, I think so because it can be still done online. Most of my clients have still remained, although some have dropped out for other reasons, like they might have lost their jobs, so they aren't able to afford counselling at the moment, which is understandable. But no, it's been pretty stable still. Yeah.
Last question for you. It's a bit of a fun one. What is something interesting that you've been up to during this period of isolation?
I prepared for this question.
Yeah, these were prepared earlier.
Yeah, well, I'm going to show you. So I love baking, and so I've been doing lots of baking. And I wanted to show you one of my creations. So I will share screen. So this is my pandan bread. So it's a pandan pull-apart bread. And,
yum.
Yeah, so I baked this the other week. So that's what I love doing.
How many tries did that take, out of curiosity? This is the polished version.
Just the one, actually.
What?
I'm quite a seasoned baker, so I like.
You must have clicked the MasterChef answer.
Yeah.
In the poll, yeah.
That's something that I love doing. So yeah.
No, with everything I make, I've tried a few recipes myself, except the first one's always just been like a little mediocre, and it's all right, and then it takes me a couple more times to kind of get it right. So yeah, you're right on the money there. Yeah. All right, so next we'll have Jess basically do a talk. So just a reminder that you can send your questions in at any point in time. So all you have to do is just click on the chat button down below from the drop-down menu, click on admin, and then our team will basically, collate all your questions so that we can have a really good Q&A session afterwards. So, yeah, take it away, Jess.
Okay. So I'm just going to share screen with you guys. 1 second. All right. Okay. All right. I hope everyone can see that there. So I just want to preface this by saying that I don't come as an expert in grief and loss. In that I think sadly, I also have my own experiences in grief and loss, and it's all part of the being human, and we're all learning together. And also, when we talk about grief and loss, I think it's quite a heavy topic. So if sometimes talking about heavy topics, it might bring up some difficult feelings for you. So if that's the case, I just want to give you permission to step out at any time, feel free to turn off your video or to mute yourself and just do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So just make sure that that you take care of yourself. When we talk about something like grief and loss. So I guess I'll give you a brief summary on what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to touch on grief and loss as in general. So what is grief and loss? But more specific in relation to COVID-19. And you might find yourself relating to some of the examples that I share that you might want to talk about during the breakout session. And we might have some questions which you can pose to admin. And also I'll talk about what are some helpful ways that you might be able to cope with some of the grief reactions that you're feeling. Okay. All right. Sorry. So what is grief? So grief is a natural response to loss. It's a very human experience and it's universal. So I would say that all of us at some point will experience grief at some point in their life, be it the death of a loved one or the loss of a job, perhaps the end of a relationship, or any other change that alters life as you know it. It's a very natural response to suffering in general. And grief is unpredictable and complex. It's not just about the feeling of sadness. It's complex, it's unpredictable because we don't know when it will come. We don't know how long it will last or when it will end. And when we are grieving, we just want a simple roadmap often. We just want it to be over. But grief is complex and it affects our minds, our bodies, and our spirit. And I guess the reason why this is so relevant at the moment is because grief is often present when there is uncertainty and change, which in the midst of COVID-19 is what many of us are experiencing. So all of us have been affected by COVID-19 in some way. So again, this is how we want grief to work, but often grief actually looks quite messy. When we think about grief, we often think that it's a focus on the past, so the thing or the person that we have lost, but that's actually not all of the picture. Grief is often tied up with both the past and the future. So it's an experience in the present that is tied up in the past and in the future. What I mean by that is that in the past, there's a focus on loss. And loss can be material things, such as a job or a loved one or even your living situation. But it can also be immaterial things. So many of us have experienced the loss of normalcy, what life used to look like. There's also the loss of safety and security. And maybe some of us have experienced dashed hopes and dreams. So some of us might have had to postpone wedding plans or travel plans. And I think that's a loss that's real as well. And many of us, I think, have lost a sense of connection. Even the way that we connect is different. Even now, we're connecting online, and that's different. And we're really missing that face-to-face connection. But there's also a focus on the future when it comes to grief. So anticipatory grief over what things will look like in the future, uncertainty about what the future holds, and the sense that there is more loss yet to come. Many of us have many questions about what will happen to me, when will things return to normal, when will we find a vaccine? And there's a sense of fearful anticipation. There's a lot of unanswered questions, which can be difficult to sit with because many of these questions can't be answered at the moment. Grief can also bring about existential anxiety or crisis. And this is how we try to make meaning of what's happening. So we ask questions like, what is the meaning and what's the purpose of this? Perhaps even asking, where is God in the midst of this? Why is God allowing this to happen? So those are big questions about the world. And there's an oscillation between the past and the future that happens in grief. And often at the beginning, there's more of a focus on the past and what we've lost. And it's hard to see what the future and have hope in that. But as time goes on, hopefully you will transition. There's a movement from the past into more of a focus in the future where you can see the light at the end of the tunnel and hope in the future. And this is what people call kind of moving on. But I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. There's collective grief. So I don't know if any one of you recognize where the picture is taken, but this is in Martin Place after the Lynn Cafe hostile situation in 2014. I don't know if people remember that. But there's a sense that in COVID-19, we're all in the same storm. We're all experiencing the same thing. So we're all grieving together over similar losses. And people tend to come together to share their grief. And it's comforting to know that we are not alone. The whole world is grieving in some way. But grief is also can feel quite lonely as well. There's a sense that we might be in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. COVID-19 has affected all of us individually differently. Some people have lost their jobs. Some people have had other losses, like having to homeschool, for example. But not only that, each person grieves differently in that we can go through the same experience, but react and feel differently. So there's no right or wrong way to grieve, although some people experience more complicated grief than others. But so grief is both a collective experience at the moment, but also an individual. It's very personal. I hope I'm going at a good pace, but I'll try to get through this in 20 minutes. So you might have heard of the 5 stages of grief, which was identified by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. So again, I want to say that grief is complex and complicated, and it's not linear. So these 5 stages, you can go back and forth between these stages, and you might not experience all of these stages, but it's just a helpful framework to think about grief, and you might be able to identify some of these reactions. So I'll go through them in a little bit more detail in relation specifically to COVID, but more recently, there's been a 6th stage that's been identified by David Kessler, and that's the stage finding meaning. So he says it's not enough to just accept what's happened, to just accept the loss, but also we need to find meaning in our experience. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I actually think that that's quite important. Okay, so in relation to COVID, remember grief is complex. So as I go on and talk about these stages, don't feel alarmed if your experience is different. Again, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Okay. So what are some of the signs of grief? Because perhaps you might have experienced some reactions during this time, but perhaps you don't know that it's actually a grief process that you're going through. So the first stage that Elizabeth Kübler-Ross has identified is denial. And at the early stages, there usually is denial that things are really changing. And I know for me, when things started happening in China towards the end of the year last year, I was in Taiwan, and I thought, this is not going to affect me. It's kind of out there. It's in China. I'm fine. And then in March, I attended a women's conference, hundreds of people. At that time, it was still, I was still going about things as normal. And then on that night, it was the stage 1 restrictions were announced. And the next day, our church could not gather. It was the last time that our church could gather in person. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is really happening. But at first, you can see how, there's a resistance at first. To resistance of the inevitable. And this resistance can bring about some anxiety, but we're unable to pinpoint exactly why we're feeling anxious. So I don't know if you can relate to that. I don't know if you remember where you were when the stage 1 restrictions were announced and how you felt at the time. The second stage is anger. This is when reality starts to sink in, but you're still kind of resisting the change because things are happening against our will. We didn't ask for COVID-19 to happen. When things happen against our will, there's a sense of loss of control. And we get angry at the world and we take it out on other people. So we might find ourselves perhaps more easily frustrated, more irritable at our loved ones. Anger actually masks the sadness and the pain that's underneath our grief. Because grief is painful. And so, we mask it with anger often. Sometimes there's judgment and blame because we try to look for someone else to be responsible for our grief because we can't carry all that ourselves. So we might be angry at those people who are hoarding toilet paper. We might be angry at politicians who are making these decisions that we don't like, or angry at our boss who has had to let us go, angry at our kids or spouses. The little things that annoy us are amplified. Maybe even angry with God. How can God allow this to happen? And this is a very natural response. So I want to say anger is a very natural response to grief, but we need to recognize our anger as a grief response so that we can learn healthier ways of managing it instead of taking it out on other people. The third stage is bargaining. This is where we try to look for ways that we can regain control of the outcome, because during grief, we often feel vulnerable and helpless. And it's in these moments of intense emotions that is not uncommon to ask, to bargain. So you might have lots of kind of what if or if only statements. In the bargaining stage of grief, you might find yourself creating a lot of these statements, and kind of there's an experience of this inner wrestling. And, if only I worked more over the weekend, maybe I'd still have my job now. You might find yourself making promises to yourself or to God. I promise I'll never take this for granted. I'll never take my family for granted. I'll never complain about work again. So this is, it's like a toing and froing, and it can feel like an emotional roller coaster. But it's our way of trying to regain control of the outcome. Okay. The fourth stage is when reality really starts to sink in and the focus moves from the past to more of the present. There's a move towards acceptance that things are indeed different and that there may be nothing we can do to change the reality of the loss. There's less masking of sadness, and you might feel a flood of emotions. So feelings like of emptiness, of deep sadness, maybe even hopelessness about the future. Grief is overwhelming and exhausting. It takes a lot of energy to grieve and to feel all these emotions. And so sometimes we might find ourselves not enjoying the things we used to enjoy. Maybe even withdrawing from community, which creates a sense of isolation and loneliness. And this is where, grief can feel like just really lonely, that no one can understand what it feels like. And in a sense that's true because it's personal. what you're going through is personal. But it's important at this stage not to isolate yourself too much. But there's a sense of heaviness and a feeling of, but also the sense of release as you, the feelings that you once tried to mask are being brought to the surface. Okay. And then there's acceptance, which is a movement towards hope, and this is the upward turn. So acceptance does not mean moving on or being okay about what we've lost. It's common thinking that we should move on from our grief, that there's a time frame in which we grieve. But I want to say that that's actually really unhelpful. We don't move on from our grief, or, and some people feel guilty about even experiencing some form of happiness, that it means being okay with losing our loved one or losing whatever it is that we've lost. But we don't actually move on from our grief. The experience of loss changes us. It changes us deeply, and we learn to move on. We learn to carry the loss forward into the new norm. So we don't move on from our grief. We move forward with it, in a sense that we fit our grief around the new reality. We learn to live with the loss. There's a recognition of reality and our finiteness and our limitations. For example, if we suffer the loss of a loved one, we still think about them, and we may still feel sad whenever we do, but we also find ways to hold on to the memory of them. So, for example, Blue Ribbon vanilla ice cream will always remind me of my granddad, because he used to serve that with McDonald's pancakes, and they still remind me of him. I still feel sad when I think about him, but I still find, that's my way of holding on to what I've lost and moving forward with that. And we learn to be thankful and sad at the same time, that we can both be thankful and sad at the same time. And it doesn't mean that we're okay about what we've lost. We recognize that we're not in control. So this is where Elizabeth Kubler-Ross kind of stops, and it says, okay, once you've come to this stage, then there's a sense of hope. But again, the sixth stage, finding meaning, is actually really important, because so this is a sense of what people mean by closure, I think. But it's not just about acceptance. Closure is not just about acceptance, because we are meaning-making creatures. Whatever we experience has to have a purpose. Otherwise, there's no hope, and life becomes meaningless. Our experiences don't mean anything. So finding meaning does not mean having all the answers, but we find a way to make sense of the experience. We find a way to ask ourselves, so how has this experience changed me? What do I want to hold on to? What is important to me that I want to keep? And what do I want to leave behind that I do not want? What do I want to take away from this? We each take away something different based on our values and our worldview. And we integrate this experience into the way we see ourselves and the world and God. And as Christians, I know for Christians, knowing that God is in control and that He is working things out for good, and that He is present even in the midst of COVID, helps me as a Christian make sense of this experience, even though I don't have all the answers. And I wonder for you, what is it? How have you tried to make meaning out of this experience? Perhaps you've got some questions as well. So again, grief is complicated. The stages of grief are not linear, and often your experience might look like a tangled web. And that's okay. That's perfectly normal. And it varies from individual to individual. But we move over time, we move towards creating a return to meaningful life. And I just want to talk a little bit about that. This will be my last slide. And I hope I'm still going on time. So how do we cope with grief? If going through all the slides, you've been able to identify some of your reactions during this time as grief responses, then how can we cope with grief? Firstly, we need to acknowledge it as grief and to allow ourselves to feel the grief. This includes the anger, the uncomfortable feelings. The anger. Acknowledging that anger is a mask for sadness actually helps you deal with the grief. Give yourself time to feel your sadness, to feel your grief, and to sit with it. As uncomfortable as that might be, it's okay to cry. It's okay to not be okay for a little while. Let go of what you can control. Again, we this is a very difficult time, and so if we try to control everything, we're gonna, it will be so overwhelming. So we need to be able to let go of what we can control, and try to maintain as much routine as you can. This could mean kind of getting out of those PJs, those people who clicked on PJs. Try to, maybe get out of your PJs and try to maintain some form of routine. It might mean going for exercise, cooking meals as normal, scheduling in some rest. All those things will help maintain some level of control. As much as you might feel, you might want to withdraw, it's important to stay connected as much as you can. Now that the restrictions have started to ease, it'll be easier to stay connected. So reach out to other people because grief actually needs a witness, and talking about your feelings is actually important. So find some trusted friends and family that you can talk about your feelings with, and maybe even talk to a counsellor or a psychologist about it, or even your pastor. I know that they would love to talk to you about how this is affecting you, and maybe even pray for you. Be kind to yourself and be compassionate to yourself and to other people. Again, we're all going through this. There's a collective grief. We're all going through this together. And so look out for one another. Ask each other, how are you going? How are you going with isolation? Reach out to other people. And know that we're all going through a difficult time. Be kind to yourself. Get some sleep as well. That's important. Use creative means to channel your feelings. So I know I've seen lots of people, do all sorts of DIY projects. For me, that's baking, but I've seen, people remake furniture or do some journaling. Might pick up a new hobby. Prayer or memorizing scripture is one way that as Christians we can use to channel our feelings, and God is there, and He wants to hear us in our grief. He's very present there. You can practice gratitude. So gratitude is a good antidote to bitterness. And so what are some things that you can be thankful for? Take some time, maybe even write a list of some of the things that you can be thankful for. At the end of the day, ask yourself, what is one thing that I can be thankful for today? Know that there is life after COVID, that this is just a season that we're going through, and this will end. We don't know when it will end, but it will, God willing. And there is life after that. There is hope. And, God is in control. I don't know if all of you believe what your faith value is, but as Christians, we believe that God is in control. And so often with grief, we want to move past. We want to go from point A to the end, because it's so painful and it's really hard. But what is God doing in the midst of COVID? What is God doing in your life at the moment? Because God is present now, and He might be, He is in control now. And so I wonder if, instead of jumping forward, what is it that God is teaching us now? Knowing that God is in control, even that when I am not, and that He is working things out for our good, gives a sense of hope for the future. Okay. So that's the end of my section. I hope I haven't gone over time, but stay safe, everyone, and God bless. I think we'll be breaking up into 2 breakout rooms at the moment. Is that right, Pete or someone?
I think, yeah.
Yep.
So thanks, Jess, for that talk. I think it was a very insightful explanation around grief, because often it doesn't matter what age you are, whether you're an angsty teenager or you're going through a midlife crisis. I think often when you're feeling a lot of emotion, it's hard to break it down in a logical and intellectual manner and just process it for yourself. So I think a lot of people would have questions going from that session, which brings us to the interactive part of tonight. So we are running a little bit over time, but no big deal. We'll be breaking out into breakout groups. I'm not sure how many, but our team have been working behind the scenes on basically organising us. So this is a chance for you to ask any questions you might have in a more intimate setting. Each team member who's responsible for putting tonight together has been assigned to a breakout room, and as soon as we break off, they'll introduce themselves and basically facilitate that discussion. So you can ask as many questions or talk about as many topics as you like, or as little as possible. But obviously we would love for you guys to really get into the meat and bones of grief and loss and what Jess has just shared with us. So I think
there's some questions to help you there. Feel free to focus on those questions. I think they'll be shared with you as you break out. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So our team will have these questions ready.
Anyway, I've just been thinking, and I don't know if you believe in God or a higher power, but I've wondered this question. We've been talking about grief. If there is a God, how does God feel about our grief as we grieve? Or maybe even more pointed, if there is a God who, like the God of the Bible, all powerful, all knowing, not lacking in anything, then would God feel grief at all? I mean, we saw tonight how grief is linked with loss. So really, if you have nothing to lose, you should have nothing to grieve. So if God has everything and He has all that, then He would have nothing to lose and therefore nothing to grieve, right? I don't know if you've ever considered that question, if you believe in God or not, but something I was thinking about. So I think it might be helpful to take a look at an episode in the life of God. Here's the thing: Jesus, the historical person, Jesus who lived and died 2,000 years ago. He made a big claim. His claim was that if you've seen Him, you've seen God, which is a huge claim, right? He claims that He is God who actually entered into our world and became a man. Now, I don't know if you believe that's true, but just for a moment, just entertain the thought that if it were true, hypothetically, if it is true that Jesus is God become man, then whether or not God grieves or feels loss or is just kind of, all stoic and doesn't care about us, well, I think we can probably see that in Jesus, can't we? We can see whether Jesus and how He dealt with grief. Was He immune to it? Did He grieve? What did He do with loss? So I want to share with you a picture from the life of Jesus. It's actually from one of the biographies of Jesus' life, from the Gospel of John. And look, I'll just read a little bit from it and you can just have a look while I read it. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. So how did Jesus feel about his dear friend dying and the loss of his friend Lazarus, and seeing Lazarus' sisters so moved? Well, we read here that Jesus was deeply distressed and moved. People say this is the shortest verse in the entire Bible, John 11:35, 2 words, Jesus wept. But it's such a meaningful 2 words, right? That he felt grief. He wept. But he did more than just weep. The weeping we understand, but there's a curious little bit that it says that he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, which actually in the original, so the Bible is in English that we read, but it's translated from ancient Greek. But in the original ancient Greek, where the manuscripts are written, a couple of thousand years ago, it actually means something like outrage or even anger, that idea of deeply moved and troubled. So Jesus felt outrage or anger. It's almost the kind of feeling people have felt about, George Floyd's death, the African-American man who was killed by police officers, that kind of outpouring of outrage and anger. So Jesus' grief response to his friend's death is not just sadness in that he wept, but actually anger, which is curious, isn't it? Now, if Jesus is God, as I said, then why would he feel grief and outrage? Well, as I said before, you feel grief because you've lost something. So this must be the reason why Jesus felt like something was lost. And it's not just the loss of a friend, you see. Again, if Jesus gives us a bigger picture of what God is like, then this is really telling us the God of the Bible is not immune to human suffering, that's why he entered into human suffering. And the reason why God grieves is because something is lost. Actually, when God looks at the world, he sees a world that has lost so much when we've turned away from him, our creator, because this is not the world he intended. The Bible says the world that he created was not supposed to be a world full of racism and suffering and injustice and violence and pandemics. A world where people have to die instead of live forever in perfect relationship with him and with each other. That was the world he created, but it's not that. And so there's loss. And because of that loss, God entered our world and he felt grief, not just sadness, but as I said, even outrage, right? If we feel outrage at the injustice committed against African Americans, Indigenous Australians, how much more does the God who created all races must feel outrage when he looks at the world, because this isn't meant to be. And that's really comforting. No, not all of you are Christians, but as a Christian for me, to know that the one who created me is not just far away, emotionally distant, that he actually knows what it feels like to grieve and suffer loss, be in anguish, and that when I feel outrage at injustice, that he also feels outrage. Now, God also came into the world not just to feel grief, but he also came into the world to do something about it. Jesus claims that he actually has the solution to the brokenness of the world. And to cut a long story short, that he himself would actually willingly go and die on a cross, and it was willing. Right? No one can kill God without his own permission. And he chose to be broken by the brokenness of the world, to bear the consequences of our brokenness in our place. And then 3 days later, you might know this story, he rises again from the dead. And that's really important because he's offering the hope and the promise of a new world for those who love and trust him. And you see that that promise of a new world with what he does next. So I'm just going to screen share the rest of this story. Because he gives a preview of that. So Jesus has just met his friends at the tomb, and we read on, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. So they took away the stone. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. The Bible's message, Jesus' message is that grief is not the end, right? It's not the end. Loss is not the end. Death is not the end, because he holds the key to life and eternity and the healing of all the brokenness of the world. And he does that by the way he lived, but particularly by the way he died, and by rising again from the dead, and by his promise to come back again to make everything right. Which is why these famous words are just a little bit before this bit that we read in John. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Now, I don't know where you're at with these claims of Jesus. I mean, maybe the idea of miracles and resurrection doesn't seem that likely to you. But I gather that probably like most Australians, even if you're not a Christian, you don't believe in God, there's something fascinating about Jesus, something impressive about Jesus. And I hope that's the case, because he really is fascinating. And if you've never read a biography of Jesus from the Bible, so there's 4 of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, otherwise known as the first 4 books of the New Testament. If you've never done it as an adult, it's actually worth reading. Just read it with an open mind as an adult, because this man who's influenced so many billions of people in history is fascinating. If you see a counselor about grief, and it helps at first, but over time it feels like a waste of time, should just stop going.
So the question is, should I stop going?
To a counselor if it was helpful to begin with, but it's kind of just turned out to be a waste of time afterwards, or after a little while.
All right. I guess it depends. So I think it's important that you find a counselor that's the right fit for you. So so if there's something that you don't quite like about the process or then I'd say raise it with him or her, and see if you can work it out, because it could be something that they're not aware of. It could be just different expectations or misunderstanding. But if you feel like it's the wrong fit, then it's okay to choose another counsellor. I want to say that counselling is not a comfortable process. So sometimes, you could kind of go up and down. Sometimes you might feel like you're moving forward. Sometimes you feel like, if things aren't really going anywhere. So it's a very fluid process. So I would encourage you to stick it out for maybe a few sessions. If it's something that's really bothering you, talk to them about it. But if at the end of the day, if you feel like it's not the right fit, then it's okay to find another person, and you're not obliged to stay with that person. So yeah.
Great, that's really helpful. Em, do you have one?
Yeah, we do have another question. So this individual has stated that before lockdown, it was easier to relate with people by convenience. So how do you deal with grief when you realise the shallowness of relationships that's been really brought to the fore or highlighted during this time?
So can you repeat the first bit?
We might just post that up on the chat. Is that cool? I'll just cut and paste it.
Yeah.
Jess,
I
can you
think
see
this
that?
person's just wanting to understand how do you grieve for relationships that you realise are shallow, and you haven't realised they're shallow until this point in time because of isolation and lockdown and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I want to tread carefully with this. I think, I think COVID and lockdown changes the nature of relationships. So what you've experienced during lockdown, it's not cannot be the reality. Like you can feel more distance from people. Perhaps what this person is experiencing is maybe disappointment in how some of their friends have reacted to them in particular situations. Perhaps they find that their friends aren't reaching out as much or whatever it is, but there sounds like there's some disappointment there with the nature of the friendship. I would say talk to them. It's hard. I think there is grief there. In the disappointment is part of sadness, I think, and it's okay to when expectations have not been met, then there's a natural response of disappointment and grief with that. But I would say, if the friendship is important to you, and especially if they're a brother or sister in Christ, then don't be afraid to talk to them about it, because they might not realize what is it that you're feeling. often when we feel hurt, we want to withdraw, and because of our grief, right, it makes us want to withdraw. But I want to challenge us to kind of move forward, move towards people in our grief, even though that's hard. I'll just leave it there, I think.
Thanks, Jess. A couple of questions are all on the same track, so I might just post them up and you can either deal with one or all of them together. But this one is about someone who doesn't feel they confront their grief very well or ready to deal with it. How do I start in a way that's safe and healthy? And I guess related is, what happens when you ignore your grief? How do we face it if it feels too much?
Yeah. Look, again, everyone's different, and if you're not ready to feel the full gamut of emotions when it comes to grief, then that's okay. I guess you need to acknowledge that, though. I think it is important that you acknowledge that you are grieving and that it's a difficult process. I think, but it does come out in different ways. So, perhaps reflect on what are some ways that, in masking your grief or in trying to hold it in, how is it coming out in terms of the way that you relate to people or the way that you're thinking about yourself? I would say if you're not able to confront or ready to deal with what's there, if you're a Christian, can you talk to God about it? Because I think that's a good place to start. He is the safest place for us to express our grief. I think if we don't learn to grieve well, then we can become stuck in some of the stages. So, for example, if we try to mask our grief with anger all the time, then we're going to lose our friendships. We're going to be stuck in that stage. Or if we're constantly feeling sad, or that we're unable to kind of see any light at the end of the tunnel, or then grief kind of becomes a little bit more complicated, and we might become stuck in that depressed kind of that depressed stage. If you find yourself being stuck, then especially in the depressed stage, then talk to a professional about it and get some help with that. Again, doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It just means that you might need someone to help you walk through that process. I think grief needs to be witnessed. So we're not meant to grieve alone. Grief actually should cause us to seek comfort and to seek help, to seek connection. It's actually, the grief response, I think it's a very human response, because it's meant to actually prompt us to seek connection, whether or not it's to other people or with God. It's not stagnant. So, I want to say that I think grief should move us towards other people and towards God. And if you feel like you're stuck, then please talk to a professional about it. Yeah.
That kind of leads us on to another theme that we've gotten through the questions, which is, how would you help someone get through grief, whether it's a child or an adult, or they don't even know they're grieving? How do you identify and help someone new to you through it?
Yeah. So you need to meet people where they're at, and to recognize, like, for example, if someone's reacting in anger, then recognize that maybe it's a mask for something deeper, and to be gentle in the way that you do that, and when we identify, perhaps if the person doesn't know that they're actually grieving, and to say, hey, I wonder, if this anger that you're expressing, I wonder what's going on there? You know, what's making you so frustrated? It sounds like there's something that's really bothering you, and I wonder why. So be curious. And I think it's hard to sit with people in their grief because it's uncomfortable for us. Grief kind of, it's like this elephant in the room, and it kind of bleeds onto you. Sometimes it feels like that. It feels the air is stale and you don't know what to say. If you don't know what to say, then the best thing to say is the best thing to do is just to sit with them. There's a chapter in Job where Job's friends actually just sits with them, with him in his grief. And that's a very appropriate response, that I'm here for you. I don't know what to say, and I don't understand what it is that you're going through, because I haven't experienced what it is that you're going through, but I'm here to listen, and whenever you're ready. It's about kind of holding space for that person to, and when I say holding space, it means kind of being present, using your presence to hold space, so the person feels safe, whatever it is that they're experiencing, and just to be there for them. Don't be so quick to jump to throwing Bible verses or to pray for them. You know, I think that's a good response, but don't be too quick to jump to that. There's so much to say on that. But the best thing you can do is to show empathy and to hold space for the person.
And just a bit of an extension to that as well. What if the person in question is kind of resorting to unhelpful ways of coping with grief? So, for example, whether it's alcohol or drugs or escapism, is it the same? Do you pretty much use the same approach with that, or is there something different?
It depends on whether or not they acknowledge what they're doing is where they're at in wanting to change. I think still you need to be gentle and compassionate and kind. And, you know, I think when it comes to addictions, it's a way for people to cope with difficult emotions. If we take that away, we need to make sure that the person is able to cope in other ways. So if you're not a professional, then don't try to solve everything for them. The best thing you can do again is to be there for them, and to direct them to a professional to help them with that. Especially if it's things like alcoholism or.
Thanks, Jess. We have time for one more question, and I think this one I'll direct it to yourself, Pete.
Yep. Sure.
And this is, how would you encourage a Christian friend that is experiencing grief but cannot reconcile their grief with their faith in God?
Yeah, there's lots you could say. I think the thing that I would recommend is sort of what Jess has been saying, but actually allow yourself to recognize that you are grieving and that you're angry at God, and to actually recognize that it's okay to feel those feelings. I think a lot of people who have faith in God feel like I'm not permitted to complain, or I'm not permitted to be angry at God. And actually, you'll find lots of instances in the Bible where people were angry at God and expressed it. And I think if you're a Christian and you feel frustrated and angry at God, but you don't feel like you have permission to say anything, what happens is you just don't say anything. And that actually cuts off communication between you and the one who actually is going to kind of hold the answers to you connecting with him again. So even if it's to reach out to him and just say, look, God, I'm just frustrated. I'm pissed off at you. I'm really angry at you. And here are the reasons why. That's actually a good start. I mean, there's much more I want to say after that, but I feel like a lot of people who are grieving, who are Christians, just don't even go there because they don't feel like they have permission to go there. And I actually want to say that's probably a good first step. Recognize you're grieving, recognize you're upset. God wants to hear about it. He's big enough. He's not going to get fazed because you're telling him how upset you are. In fact, if my kids were upset at me, I want to hear them tell me. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not even anywhere near a perfect father. Well, if God is the perfect father, he wants to hear from his children. So start with that and process that with other people as well. Anyway, that's probably just to begin with, but there's more than probably we could say. Can I just ask before we finish up with this section, Jess, do you want to post an email address?
Oh, sure.
That way if people want to contact you, they can. Because there was a whole heap of other questions that didn't get answered. So if you have a work email address and people want to contact you, that'd be great. If you want to get in touch with me, I'll post my email address too. Feel free to contact me.
Yep. Can I just add to what Pete was saying, just quickly? So, as I said, I think grief is meant to move us towards other people and to seek help, and I think it's meant to move us towards God. So, God could be using. I think God uses our grief to move us towards Him, and so I would echo what Pete has said. So, in your grief, in your anger, and even in that bargaining stage, that's where we kind of, that inner wrestling, like to bring that to God, because He uses that.
Yeah.